The old veteran slowly placed his military medals onto the cold counter of a pawn shop in downtown Chicago, and for a moment, the entire store fell silent, except for the low hum of an old ceiling fan. At first, the pawn shop owner didn't even realize the medals were real United States Marine Corps decorations earned during the Iraq War. But when he looked closer at the scratched metal and the faded photograph of a young sergeant in uniform, his expression suddenly changed. "Sir, are you sure about this?" the man asked quietly. Jackson Miller stared at the Purple Heart medal he had received after an explosion in Fallujah and calmly replied, "That family needs the money more than I need these." Only an hour earlier, Jackson had been sitting alone in a small diner across from the hospital when he overheard a young woman crying on the phone, begging the bank for more time and saying her little boy could be taken off life support because she couldn't pay the medical bills anymore. Jackson didn't know them. He didn't even know their names. But the moment he heard the child coughing at the nearby table, memories of his own son came rushing back into his mind. After returning from Iraq, Jackson's marriage slowly collapsed. His wife eventually took their child and moved to another state because she could no longer live with a man who woke up screaming in the middle of the night and reached for a pistol every time he heard a sudden noise. Since then, Jackson had been living alone in a tiny apartment, working as an auto mechanic and barely speaking to anyone. But something inside him broke that day in the diner. Without saying a word, he went home, opened an old box filled with medals, folded American flags, and faded photographs of Marines who never came back from war. And 1 hour later, he was standing inside the pawn shop. When the owner handed him the cash, Jackson didn't even count it. He simply walked back to the hospital and quietly left the envelope at the front desk with a short note that read, "For the little boy, from an old Marine." Then he disappeared into the cold Chicago rain without realizing that within days, his act of kindness would inspire millions of people across America. 3 days after Jackson Miller sold his military medals, his entire life changed so suddenly that the old Marine first thought it had to be some kind of cruel joke. That morning, he was doing what he always did, repairing an old Chevrolet inside a small auto shop on the outskirts of Chicago, when the owner suddenly rushed out of the office holding a phone in his hand. "Jackson, is this you?" he shouted. On the screen was security camera footage from the hospital. The video showed an exhausted old veteran in a worn-out jacket quietly leaving a thick envelope at the front desk before walking away into the rain. Moments later, the nurse opened it and burst into tears after discovering more than $30,000 inside, enough money to fully cover little Braden's treatment. Someone from the hospital staff had posted the story online, and reporters quickly uncovered the truth. The veteran had sold his combat medals to save a family he didn't even know. Within days, the video spread across the entire country and reached millions of people. Americans couldn't believe that a man who lived such a simple, lonely life had sacrificed the most valuable things he owned for complete strangers. Jackson hated the attention and immediately started turning off the television every time someone mentioned his name. But the reporters still found his small apartment. People began gathering outside the auto shop carrying letters, American flags, food, and photographs of their own relatives who had served in the military. One evening, a young United States Marine walked up to Jackson, stood silently for a second, and saluted him. "Because of you," the Marine said quietly, "I finally believe honor still means something." Jackson lowered his eyes without answering because he never saw himself as a hero. Every night he still woke up from nightmares and saw the faces of the Marines he lost in Iraq. But the thing that affected him most wasn't the attention or the news coverage. It was a drawing made by little Braden, a picture of an old soldier with giant wings behind him and the words, "My hero." The moment Jackson saw the drawing, his hands started shaking harder than they had during combat in Fallujah. That night, he sat alone in his dark apartment, staring at photographs of his fallen friends, and for the first time in years, allowed himself to wonder if maybe his life wasn't over yet. But he still had no idea that the biggest change was only beginning. Within weeks, Jackson Miller's name had become known across America. But the old Marine still showed up every morning at the same small auto repair shop on the outskirts of Chicago, trying to pretend nothing had changed. But one morning, when he arrived at work, he froze in shock. A massive crowd had gathered outside the garage holding American flags, handwritten signs, and donation boxes for struggling veterans and military families. Reporters shouted his name from every direction while people waited just to shake the hand of the man who sold his combat medals to save a stranger's child. Jackson stood there speechless because he couldn't understand why people suddenly saw him as a hero. In his mind, the real heroes were still buried in the sands of Iraq. Then an elderly woman slowly stepped toward him, holding a photograph of a young soldier in uniform. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "My son came home from Afghanistan completely broken," she whispered. "He locked himself in his room for 2 years and stopped talking to everyone. But after hearing your story, he finally came downstairs." Then another family approached him. Then another. Some cried, some hugged him, others simply thanked him for reminding them that kindness still existed in the world. That night, Jackson sat alone inside his apartment, reading thousands of messages from veterans across the country. Some asked for help. Others admitted they were battling PTSD, homelessness, addiction, or depression. Many of them said his story made them feel seen for the first time in years. As Jackson stared at little Braden's drawing taped to the wall beside his bed, a terrifying thought slowly entered his mind. What if he could actually do something bigger than himself? The next morning, Jackson sold his old Harley-Davidson motorcycle, combined the money with the donations people had started sending him, and rented a small office near downtown Chicago. A few days later, a simple sign appeared on the front door. The Miller Foundation. Veterans never fight alone. At first, many of them said his story made them feel seen for the first time in years. As Jackson stared at little Braden's drawing taped to the wall beside his bed, a terrifying thought slowly entered his mind. What if he could actually do something bigger than himself? The next morning, Jackson sold his old Harley-Davidson motorcycle, combined the money with the donations people had started sending him, and rented a small office near downtown Chicago. A few days later, a simple sign appeared on the front door. The Miller Foundation. Veterans never fight alone. At first, it was nothing more than a tiny room with an old coffee machine, a worn-out couch, and a phone line for struggling veterans who had nowhere else to turn. But people started coming almost immediately. Some had lost their homes. Others couldn't afford therapy or medication. Some just needed someone who truly understood what war had done to them. And every time Jackson looked into their exhausted eyes, he saw the same pain he had once seen in his own reflection. But one evening, just as the foundation started gaining national attention, a man in an expensive suit walked into the office carrying a thick folder and quietly placed it on Jackson's desk. "Mr. Miller," he said, "major companies want to invest in your foundation. We're talking about millions of dollars." Jackson slowly looked up, completely unaware that his life was about to change forever. Jackson felt something tighten painfully inside his chest. For years, he believed the war had destroyed him forever, but now he stood in the middle of a crowded hospital, surrounded by people whose lives had changed because of one single act of kindness. A few weeks later, one of the largest television networks in America invited him for an interview. Near the end of the broadcast, the host looked directly at Jackson and asked, "Mr. Miller, you sold the most valuable things you owned. Why?" The studio fell silent. Jackson lowered his eyes for a moment before quietly answering, "Because medals mean nothing if you forget why you wore the uniform in the first place." The quote spread across America by the next morning. Newspapers printed it on front pages, veterans shared it online, millions of people repeated his words. But late that same night, Jackson sat alone inside his office, looking at old photographs of the Marines he had lost in Iraq, and realized something had finally changed inside him. The pain wasn't gone, the nightmares still came sometimes, but for the first time since the war ended, he no longer felt alone. And as long as there was even one forgotten veteran left fighting in silence, Jackson Miller knew his mission wasn't over yet.